Think back for a moment. Picture the winter of 1977. America had been here before. Just a decade earlier, the blizzards of the 1960s had taught hard lessons. Cities had plans now. Crews were better equipped. People believed they knew what to expect. Radios still sat on kitchen counters. Morning papers landed on frozen doorsteps. You checked the sky, not an app. When the first cold waves arrived, it didn't feel like a crisis. It felt familiar. "We've seen this before," people said as they shoveled their driveways. But this winter wasn't coming to make a statement. It was coming to stay. The cold deepened until it felt like the very air was brittle, ready to shatter. Snow didn't just fall, it reclaimed the land. It swallowed fences, then porches, then first-floor windows. And slowly something changed. The familiar rhythm of the season was gone. By the time people realized this wasn't another storm, it wasn't even another winter, the country was already frozen in place. This is the story of the winter that didn't end. The winter of 1977. Buffalo, New York had always known winter. The city wore its reputation like a badge of honor. Lake-effect snow was part of the vocabulary here. But what Buffalo was about to face, the rest of America was already beginning to learn. From the frozen rivers of Ohio to the empty natural gas pipelines of the Northeast, from shuttered factories in Pennsylvania to crop-killing frost in the Deep South, the winter of 1977 was closing in on the entire nation. Buffalo was the place where the brutal arithmetic of cold, wind, and snow reached its most punishing. But the story that unfolded there was America's story too. By December of 1976, the snow had already started piling up in western New York. By mid-January, the city had received roughly its entire average annual snowfall, close to 90 inches. And January wasn't even half over. The streets were narrowing. Snowbanks rose higher than car roofs. Plow drivers worked double shifts, then triple shifts, pushing back against a white tide that refused to stop. But people bore up. They always did. What they didn't know was that the worst hadn't even arrived yet. On the night of January 26th, a young man named David was driving home from his job at an oil refinery. It was just after midnight. Snow was falling once again. He decided to take the Buffalo Skyway, a concrete bridge that arches more than 100 feet above the harbor. As he climbed the bridge, the storm intensified. Visibility dropped to nothing. It was like someone had thrown a white sheet over his windshield. He couldn't see the road. He couldn't see the cars in front of him. He could only hope he wouldn't hit anything. Near the peak of the bridge, traffic stopped. David wasn't worried at first. He had a full tank of gas, a warm coat. He figured he'd wait it out. He waited 4 hours. By then, other motorists had joined him in his car. Their vehicles had run out of gas. The temperature outside had plunged to somewhere around 40 below zero with the wind chill. The gas gauge in David's car was slipping toward empty. Somewhere on that bridge, a police officer was working his way from car to car, checking on stranded drivers. The wind was so fierce he could barely stand. The streetlights looked like pinheads in the swirling white. His main fear was walking off the edge of the bridge into nothing. Behind a truck, he noticed a strange mound. As he got closer, he realized it was a car buried in snow. No engine running, no signs of life. He scratched through the frost on the window with his fingernail and peered inside. The driver was sitting there motionless. The officer pulled him out and carried him to a nearby truck. He had found the man just in time. Back on the Skyway, David watched his gas gauge drop into the red. Then he saw flashlights moving through the snow. Firefighters, tethered together to keep the wind from ripping them apart, were making their way toward his car. They led him and the other stranded passengers to an emergency van and drove them off the bridge. Years later, David would say he'd never forget that night, the relief of being rescued, the understanding that he'd come very close to not making it at all. That storm on the Skyway was just a warning shot, a glimpse of what was coming, and not just for Buffalo. Across the eastern half of the country, January 1977 was shaping up to be one of the coldest months in recorded history. In Ohio, the temperature dropped so low that rivers froze solid, halting barge traffic. In Georgia and Florida, citrus crops were dying in the fields. The cold wasn't visiting, it had moved in. And then on January 28th, Buffalo got hit with something worse. Forecasters had been watching a system develop over northern Canada. They knew it was significant. Around mid-morning, they did something unprecedented. They issued a blizzard warning. 30 minutes later, the storm swept across frozen Lake Erie and descended on the city like a white wall. The winds were gusting over 50 miles an hour. They picked up the snow that had been sitting on the frozen lake surface, loose powder that had accumulated for weeks, and hurled it at Buffalo. When it hit buildings and hills and trees, The snow began to drift, and it drifted to heights no one had seen before. At City Hall, Street Sanitation Commissioner James Lindner looked out his fifth-floor window and watched the storm approach across the lake. He saw a dark, heavy cloud coming toward him. He knew immediately this was going to be catastrophic. He called his wife to warn her not to leave the house. She ignored him. She thought he was being a pessimist. She wouldn't make it home for 2 days. All over Buffalo, people were being pulled in off the streets, pulled out of cars, picked up off the snow where they'd been knocked down by the wind. At city court, a police officer named Raul had been waiting to testify in a criminal case, but the judge dismissed court because attorneys and witnesses couldn't get there. Raul made his way outside and was blasted by the storm. The wind was pushing and cutting into his face. He could hardly breathe. He wrapped his jacket over his head because he couldn't see. Downtown, business owners began releasing workers early. People rushed to their cars, thinking they'd make it home before things got worse. They had no idea they were heading into the most severe blizzard in the city's history. Traffic came to a standstill. Then it stopped entirely. Then it disappeared under the snow. If you could picture it, car wheels spinning uselessly, the roar of the wind drowning out everything else. People running from one place to another, cars stuck in the middle of streets, everyone trying to make it to the first door they could find. Eventually, the entire city became a parking lot. The plow drivers were still out there, trying to fight back. But this was a losing battle. One driver, a 15-year veteran named Bill, became snowbound in his rig near the lakefront. He radioed for help, but in the blinding snow, searchers couldn't find him. They could only wait for a break in the storm. He would be trapped for 15 hours. Commissioner Lindner had men working who simply broke down. Grown men, crying. "The snow keeps coming," they told him. "Every time I plow, more snow comes." He would hug them. He would cry with them. It was, he said later, like going to battle. By early evening, Lindner had to call his drivers back in. He couldn't send them out into that anymore. Not to save the streets, to save them. In office buildings and hotels across downtown, thousands of people who couldn't make it home settled in for a long night. Some estimates put the number at over 10,000 stranded in downtown alone. And on the west side of Buffalo, something worse was about to happen. Joseph and Laura Falzone had owned their corner grocery store for 43 years. They lived in a house just north of the store, in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. By 5 o'clock, they had closed the store 2 hours early and were sitting down to dinner with their children. The conversation turned to the weather, as it always did during storms like this. Their 23-year-old son, Joe, said something that would prove prophetic. "If there's a fire in this city tonight," he said, "there's no way the fire department is going to be able to get to it." A few hours later, someone knocked on their door. A neighbor boy, out of breath. "Your store's on fire," he said. It wasn't the store, it was the house on the other side of them, and the flames were spreading. Someone in the neighborhood pulled the fire alarm on a nearby corner. The call went out just before 8 o'clock. Joe grabbed his camera and ran into the street. The wind was catching the fire, intensifying it, channeling between the houses like a blowtorch. Within minutes, 4 houses were engulfed. Fire Captain Phil Marana's truck could only get within 2 blocks of the blaze. He was ordered to go on foot and confirm there was a fire. He was still a block away when he saw the glow in the sky. He could smell the smoke. He radioed for a second alarm based on nothing but that glow, which was unusual. But this was an unusual fire. Firefighter Tom Schultz was navigating his engine through a maze of abandoned cars and snowdrifts. The trip normally took 3 minutes. After more than half an hour, he was finally approaching the intersection. By the time they arrived, the embers flying off the fire were massive. They were flying across the street, threatening to ignite the entire block. Schultz thought to himself, "If this fire jumps the street, we're going to lose the city." Inside their house, the Falzone family had minutes to decide what to save. Joe ran through the rooms grabbing his mother's crystal. She ran to find $4,000 in vacation money they'd hidden in the ceiling. Strangers who'd seen the fire lined up at their door, passing boxes of possessions down the line to the family's van. Joe ran upstairs for his valuables, but flames were already shooting through the window. The wind was blowing between the houses like a furnace. Windows were cracking, drapes were catching fire. That was the last thing he saw of his childhood home. After several hours, firefighters finally got the blaze under control. 5 houses were destroyed, 2 others badly damaged. The Falzone family lost their home, but their store survived. Amazingly, no one died. Tom Schultz's fire engine wasn't so lucky. Water from the hoses had crept up to the running boards and frozen solid. The truck was locked in nearly 2 feet of ice. It wouldn't move for days. Looters stripped it of its radios, its brass nozzles, anything of value. By midnight, the blizzard had raged for more than 12 hours. The governor had declared a state of emergency, and the storm still wasn't finished. The next morning, dawn revealed the scale of what had happened. Reporter Lee Coppola had spent the night at the Buffalo Evening News office. When he finally went outside, he was awestruck by what he saw. Complete desolation, he described it later. Like a bomb had fallen and the community was filled with radioactive dust that was white. There wasn't anything that stirred. The roads were buried under drifts that reached second-story windows. Thousands of cars were scattered across roadways, abandoned where they'd stalled. Some were completely invisible under the snow. And then, just as people thought they were coming out of a 1 or 2 day storm, the unthinkable happened. The blizzard struck again. Cutting winds and blowing snow shut down roads that had just reopened. In the suburbs, drifts as hard as concrete threatened to lock people in their homes. Families grabbed shovels and picks, trying to break out. Some had to tunnel through their front doors. The city wasn't just snowed in, it was buried alive. Commissioner Lindner looked at the situation and said something he'd never said before. "We're in trouble. The city's in bad shape. We're going to lose the city." They didn't lose it, but it took everything they had. Volunteers from snowmobile clubs became the city's lifeline. They delivered insulin to trapped diabetics. They transported doctors to hospitals. They brought baby formula to mothers who couldn't leave their homes. Rescuers searched the thousands of abandoned cars for survivors. Some they found in time, others they didn't. Police officer Raoul was sent to an apartment to check on a reported death. An elderly woman told him her husband of over 40 years had passed away after a long illness. Raoul explained the situation. The city was paralyzed. No one could come for the body. Not that day, maybe not the next. He suggested she prop open a window to keep the room cold. The woman looked at him calmly. "Son," she said, "I spent over 40 years with this man. One more day won't hurt." She offered him a cup of coffee before he went back out into the cold. That's what Buffalo was like that week. People finding ways to cope, finding ways to help each other, finding small moments of grace in the middle of a catastrophe. But Buffalo wasn't alone in its struggle. The same brutal cold that had fueled the blizzard was paralyzing the entire eastern half of the country. In Ohio and Pennsylvania, natural gas shortages forced factories to close. Hundreds of thousands of workers were sent home. Schools shut down not because of snow, but because there wasn't enough fuel to heat the buildings. In some areas, the gas pressure dropped so low that pilot lights went out in homes, leaving families without heat in temperatures that dipped well below zero. In the South, the damage was different but equally severe. Florida's citrus groves, the backbone of the state's agricultural economy, were devastated by frost. Farmers watched helplessly as entire harvests froze on the trees. The losses would eventually climb into the hundreds of millions of dollars. This wasn't a regional event anymore. It was a national crisis. President Carter, barely a week into his administration, was forced to declare energy emergencies across multiple states. The winter of 1977 was testing the country's infrastructure in ways no one had anticipated. And in Buffalo, the test was far from over. 80 miles south of the city, in Bradford, Pennsylvania, a 5-month-old boy named Robbie was getting sicker. His mother had thought it was the flu, but by the first week of February, he was critically ill. Doctors at the local hospital couldn't figure out what was wrong. They needed to get him to Children's Hospital in Buffalo, where urgent pediatric cases were sent, but the roads were still impassable. A command pilot at the National Guard base said it was too risky to fly in near-zero visibility. At 4 in the morning, Dr. John Cudmore received a call. The pilot had changed his mind. "If you're nuts enough to fly in this weather," the pilot said, "I think we can fly." The helicopter lifted off into the storm. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The crew followed power lines, hovering just above them, using the cleared swath beneath the wires as a guide. 50 minutes later, they landed at Bradford. 10 minutes after that, with Robbie in an incubator, they lifted off again. In the cabin, Dr. Cudmore tucked his wool sweater around the infant to keep him warm. The only way to know if the baby was getting enough oxygen was to let him grip his finger. When the grip weakened, Cudmore turned up the oxygen. The helicopter touched down safely in Buffalo around 10 in the morning. Robbie was diagnosed with a congenital condition. He lived with his family for 17 years before passing away. His mother never forgot what the National Guard did. The crew received the New York State Medal of Valor for that flight. By Saturday, President Carter had declared federal emergencies in parts of western New York. By Sunday, Governor Hugh Carey arrived in a cargo plane filled with snow removal equipment. The economic consequences in an already recessed area, he said, are such that the area cannot be expected to go it alone. But Buffalo didn't wait for help to arrive. Neighbors were already digging each other out. Strangers were sharing food and shelter. A working-class city with an economy already in recession was pulling together in ways no one had planned for. One family arrived in Buffalo at the height of the storm, a mother and her 18-year-old daughter driving a station wagon packed with household goods. The moving truck was days behind them. They made it to their house and slept on the floors. The mother had insisted that most of the home canned goods and basic food go in their vehicle. There was little room for anything else. The blizzard in Buffalo claimed around 30 lives across the region. Many froze in cars. Others died from carbon monoxide poisoning as they tried to stay warm. Damage estimates climbed into the hundreds of millions of dollars. President Carter declared 9 counties in northern and western New York federal disaster areas. It was the first time that designation had ever been made because of snow. To get 5 or 6 days of those conditions, one meteorologist observed, was certainly unprecedented, a once-in-a-100-year event. It took more than 2 weeks to dig out completely. Some of the snow was loaded into rail cars and sent south to melt. But the people of Buffalo didn't wait for the snow to disappear before they started rebuilding their lives. The firefighter whose engine froze to the street eventually got it back to the station. Every year after that, on the anniversary of the blizzard, a fruit and vegetable vendor he'd rescued would send a basket to the firehouse. A card would come with it. "You saved my life." The vendor kept sending those baskets until the day he died. And Buffalo remembered. Ask anyone who lived through it. They'll tell you exactly where they were when the storm hit. They'll tell you about the wind, the cold, the moment when they realized this wasn't just another winter. One resident put it simply, "We showed that we are a strong community. Everybody became better for it. It gave you a sense of helping people, not having something so devastating ruin a community." But they also learned something that winter, something important. People had always understood snow. They could cope with it, shovel it off their walks, wait for it to melt. The winter of 1977 taught them that sometimes nature isn't going to let you do that. Sometimes it's so powerful and so strong that it overcomes even the best efforts of human beings. Across the country, the lessons were similar. The natural gas shortages exposed how vulnerable the nation's energy infrastructure really was. The factory closures revealed how quickly an economy could grind to a halt. The frozen crops in Florida showed that even the Sun Belt wasn't immune. The winter of 1977 didn't just test one city, it tested a nation. In December 2001, Buffalo would be tested again. A 5-day storm dropped nearly 7 feet of snow on the city. But the lessons of 1977 hadn't been forgotten. The response was faster, the coordination better, the death toll lower. The winter of 1977 changed how Buffalo thought about itself, changed how it prepared, changed how neighbors looked out for each other, because they'd learned that winter isn't just about snow, it's about endurance, about community, about what happens when ordinary life is suspended and people have to rely on each other. The reporter who'd stood in the street that first morning, looking at the devastation, would think about it for years afterward. "I am still awestruck by the sight," he said. "Complete desolation. There wasn't anything that stirred." But that wasn't the whole story. The whole story was what came next. The winter of 1977 didn't just freeze America. It revealed something about the people who lived through it, their resilience, their stubbornness, their refusal to give up. 50 years later, the people who were there still remember. The parents who stayed up all night keeping the house warm, the neighbors who shared food when the stores were closed, the strangers who became friends because they had no other choice. One woman captured it perfectly. She'd arrived in Buffalo during the storm with her mother. They'd slept on the floor of an empty house. They'd made do with what they had. "Snow is only so high until it melts," she wrote. "It's only cold until it gets warm. Love your families." Her mother taught her that. The storm of 1977 taught the rest of us. If you lived through the winter of 1977, share your story in the comments. These memories matter. They connect us to each other. They remind us what we're capable of enduring, and they deserve to be preserved. If you'd like to support this channel, consider becoming our first member or leaving a super thanks. Every like and comment truly means a lot. Thank you for being here.